Aneen, welcome to all of you. I appreciate you taking the time from very busy schedules at a very busy time of the year. Really do want to encourage people to ask questions along the way, either by using the chat bar down below there or just pause us and ask us a question for clarity. I have to admit that for me it's web trainings are a bit of a new thing, and I'm not as comfortable as if I was with you face to face. So apologize for any or acknowledge any nervousness on my part. So I guess we have a limited amount of time, and some of you I know, some of you I don't know, but again, just welcome, and I'm very honored that you would take your time during this time of the year to listen to this and to afford me any time at all. Thank you. So let's go to the first slide and just get going then. Okay, so historically the work to end violence against women has been seen as work, it's been done by and for women. Next slide and I'll elaborate. And this work has been, can we go to the next slide so I can elaborate? So really since the 70s in this country anyway, it's really been women who have built the foundation and contributed to the growth of knowledge base that currently informs all policymakers and communities and organizations that are addressing these issues. And truly I would ask people to always think back and remember that the initial work in our tribal communities has been forefronted by the efforts of women. And so I think it's important to always consider that when we're doing the work, and always honor the voices of victim survivors when we're doing our work, when we're planning policies, procedures, protocols, and that we keep in the forefront of our minds the safety and autonomy of women and children and all victim survivors of these issues. Well, next slide, please. So we as men who have been doing this work, tribal men, non-tribal men, I myself am Mohawk and Scott from the Northeast. I am now working for the last 14 years in the Northwest. I have to be very cognizant of my place as a man doing this work. I have to be aware that although I may be tribal, I'm from a different community, and I have to respect the work that's done in each of the local communities that I'm involved in. And I really always have to listen to the voices of my sisters who have been doing this work for many years. And those are the grandmas, the aunties, the mothers of this movement that have really kind of laid down the total foundation for this work. Next slide. So statistics show that men perpetrate the majority of violence towards women, and when you think about it in our communities, we as men, we have a huge responsibility. We do, even though it may be hard for us to hear, we do perpetrate the majority of violence towards women. We certainly perpetrate the majority of violence towards men. So we have a huge responsibility overall in trying to change the outcomes. And it doesn't mean, I'm not trying to say that all of us as men are assaulting women, but the percentage of men that do kind of leave it open for those other men who don't, and if we don't hold them accountable or if we don't engage them in doing the work, then we're not going to make significant overall changes in the work, even though there have been women doing this work for the past 30 years in our communities. So I always want to emphasize the fact that even though a majority of the violence perpetrated towards women and men in the community is done by men, it doesn't mean that all men are doing that. However, there's many of us who have often used subtle forms of abusive or controlling behaviors, and we're not really aware of not only what the behavior is, but we're also not really aware of the effects of that behavior on others. We're not really aware of the behavior on ourselves or on our communities. So we'll talk about that a little bit as we move forward. Next slide. Okay, so the majority of men who claim not to contribute to this epidemic of violence towards women, really, to be honest, we haven't done much. And I think standing back and saying, hey, look, I've not hit a woman, that's not enough. If we can't hold our brothers, our uncles, our nephews, our sons, our other members of the community, because our belief in tribal communities is that we're all related, if we can't hold our relatives accountable, then we're really colluding with the problem. Next slide. So I really want to emphasize the fact that when we're silent on this issue, that we're complicit. When we're not holding people accountable, when we're not holding our brothers accountable, then we're complicit. That it's almost like we are colluding with them on a real subtle level by not saying anything. And every community, I don't care what community you talk about, has this already accepted level of violence that we've been tolerating for years. We look the other way for lots of different reasons. Somebody's status, somebody's name status, other good things that they're doing in the community, and then sometimes look at it in terms of, well, that's just behavior that's been happening in our community, and don't work to hold people accountable, don't say things to people. And when we do that, our silence gives permission for any kind of abusive, controlling, or violent behavior to continue. Next slide. So if we believe in the work to promote sovereignty for our nations and safety for our communities, then it's important that as men and as community members that we support safety, autonomy, and sovereignty for women as well. It's many of us have experienced, men and women have experienced, people being in the longhouse, people being in the sweat lodge, people, praying and saying good things and doing good work and talking about very important issues around sovereignty and rights for our community. Yet a large percentage of our community, the women in our community, aren't afforded the same kind of notion of sovereignty and autonomy. Next slide. So as men, we can play a critical role in this work to end violence by joining with women to help them build a cultural base based on nonviolence and gender equality. And basically what we're going to try to do today in the little bit of time that we have is kind of talk about how we can encourage men, how we can engage men in doing this work. I think that that's been a struggle all along. We have trouble, we have a difficulty in getting men to attend classes if they've been held accountable by people in the community to look at their behavior, and we have difficulty engaging men in doing the work to hold our brothers accountable. So again, as we go along, if people have specific questions that they would like answered, or if they have thoughts that they want to include, challenges that they want to make, please, we're pretty open to that. And as long as we have the time and ability to do it, I can't say I can answer all questions. Although I used to do a thing in children's classes where I would tell the children that you could ask my brother and I anything, and we could ask and we could answer that question. And of course, I was in Minnesota at the time, so kids would be sitting there thinking hard. Finally, they'd come up with a very difficult question, and I would just say, "Well, you'd have to ask my brother, and he's in California." So, but I will try to make an attempt to answer or address any of the questions that are asked. Okay, next slide. So it's important for us to understand the profound and damaging impact of this violence, what it has on the victims and as a community as a whole. This is not just about what happens between two people. We really have the notion in our communities that what affects one member of a community affects the whole community. And so if our negative behavior affects the whole community, so would our positive behavior. So it's really about shifting the paradigm from that. You know, that one of the things we're going to talk about today is that hopefully moving away from a punishment mindset and moving on to more of an educational mindset. We're real aware that many of us as men have dishonored our names, dishonored ourselves, dishonored our partners and our families, dishonored our communities, dishonored our tribe. But as men, we still have the opportunity, if we choose to be accountable for that behavior, to restore or return to honor and to change that, to become better parents, to become better partners, and to become better role models for everybody in the community, including other men. Okay, next slide. So when women are physically assaulted by partners or ex-partners, are forced to be sexual, constantly put down or threatened and abused, this not only harms them, but it does harm the whole community. You know, it contributes to this overall level of acceptance for the behavior. Children learn that, especially young men and boys learn that they're almost entitled to use this behavior based on what they're seeing by other respected men in the community. So whether it's uncles or tribal council members or people working in positions of authority or respect in the community, people leading drum groups, dance groups, teaching the language, right, that they have an important role in looking at how this behavior affects all of us and how it does affect the whole community. That it's not just the notion of what happens in one's home environment only affects those immediate family members. It trickles out and affects all our relatives, all our community members. Again, I just want to acknowledge that this is very awkward for me to do this over the phone like this, and so I'm struggling through it as we continue. Okay, so move to the next slide, please. So there's a sad reality that in many cases the most unsafe place for women is in their own homes, and this is true in tribal community. This is, you know, in tribal community we have both the issues of our own men in our own community, our own relatives that are perpetrating violence towards women in their homes, but we also have a lot of men from outside the reservation, from other tribes, and certainly from other cultures who come in, and there's lots of statistical documentation that a large percentage of the violence that's done towards Native women is done by non-Native men or men from other communities. I mean, the recent information that comes out, for instance, 1 in 5 women across the U.S. generally have been sexually assaulted, sometimes rape and sometimes in other forms. But that's a huge number. As men, there's a certain comfort that we have knowing that we can go almost anywhere, and it's much, much less likely that we're going to be sexually assaulted. And certainly we're not a much lower percentage will be sexually assaulted in their own homes. And so I really think that if we want our communities to be safe, then we have to have our homes be safe. And so talking with men in the community about that is extremely important. So I will I tend to talk fast when I'm nervous, so I don't want to just rush through this material. I do want people to take the time to make points themselves if they have it, or to ask questions along the way. Next slide, please. So there's this interesting dynamic that happens, that we have this large percentage of violence that's happening towards women, children, and other victims in our community. I mean, certainly there are men and boys that are being physically and sexually assaulted in our community as well. Lots of times by other men, sometimes by women. We don't want to discount that number, even though it's a much smaller number. But we certainly want to think about the notion that the women in our communities were at one time held as sacred, that they were the givers of the life, the passers on of future generations, the passers on of other information in the culture. And excuse me, I was reading something on the chat thing there. And so we're faced with this dilemma culturally, traditionally, every day in our communities. We have the cultural notion that women were held sacred, yet they're not being treated in even the most basic, respectful way sometimes. So that's going to be an important thing for us to consider as we have this conversation in how we engage men to do this work. Next slide. So there's some simple and very proactive steps that we can take to encourage men to be part of the solution, to engage them as allies in this work. I think there's cautions along the way. I think oftentimes when we as men get into doing this work, that there can be a tendency to kind of take over in a way. And so it's always important to be respectful of the work that is being done by women. Sometimes we want to put ourselves out there on the forefront, and even though it's important for other men to see us doing the work, it's extremely important that we don't usurp the kind of energies that have been being done by years for women. So there's an example that I like to give from about, it must be about 20 years ago when I was doing this work in Minneapolis at Division of Indian Work, and we were having a Take Back the Night rally, which is something that many of you are familiar with, where we were saying that the evening and the nighttime is an unsafe time for women, and that we want women to be able to walk safely in our communities. And so there was going to be a big march happening, and I use this example quite often, so I just want to acknowledge it. If you've heard me talk before, I might have used it before, but so we were going to have this big men, and a group of men showed up, and they said, well, we want to march right at the front of the parade. We want to be right out there in front, and just to show our support. And I said, well, that could be helpful. I wonder if there's something else we could do. And then men said, well, maybe we could walk at the back of the march and just follow the women and show that we support the women. And so again I said, well, that could be helpful. It's important to show support in that way. And then men started talking about, well, we could just walk interspersed with our partners, with our friends, with our colleagues and coworkers, and show support. And yes, that's a third way that we could do this and that we could show support. But how about if we didn't march? And there was almost an outrage. It's like, no, we want to march. We want to be supportive. We want to show our support. I said, well, how about if you didn't march, but you did child care so that other women could march? How about if you put together wagons and little floats so that kids, you could pull kids along as well? How about if you stayed back and personed the tables for refreshments and made food and contributed in that way? And I guess my point was that you don't have to be out there with a sign saying, hey, I'm one of the good guys, whatever that really means, or showing your support in that way. That there are genuine efforts that we can make as men to support these efforts, and that we don't have to be right out there in the forefront, that we can do some of that work from the background that makes things run smoother and that encourages other people or gives even the availability of time for women to do that. And then I talked even further about, there's going to be workshops along with the march itself. You could hold workshops to talk to other men about these issues. You could do playtime or child care so that women could attend the workshops, those kinds of things. So I think it's important that when we're thinking about proactive steps as men, that we don't just kind of take over the forefront of the work. Let's move to the next slide, please. So education's important. Educating men just not simply on the issues, but the negative effects it has on themselves, on their partners, on their families, and the communities. It's one thing for us as men, or for anyone, to say that, okay, I acknowledge that I've done this kind of behavior, and I'm going to stop it. But there's a certain amount of trust that gets built when you can not just talk about stopping behavior, but that you're able to articulate or talk about what the effect has been on yourself, what the effect has been on your partners or on your family members or on your community members. That it's extremely important that we think about those effects and not just the behaviors. Oftentimes in men programming, if you ask men for examples from their lives, they're going to be able to tell you right away, and often attempt to tell you examples of other people, their partner or other people's behavior, and what they're doing or what they've done. And really, part of that is just diffusing it or taking the focus off themselves. But part of it is that they understand other people's behavior towards them because they know what it's felt like. And they have experienced it. And so if it's caused them pain or embarrassment or any kind of inconvenience in any way, they're able to talk about that. But they're not as easily ready to talk about how this stuff has affected other people. They're not really looking at how their behavior has had this long-standing impact. So just stopping the behavior is never going to be enough. Just acknowledging sometimes that how you've acted in the past just triggers painful memories for the person that you're talking to. So just saying that you're going to stop behavior is never going to be enough in our community. We have to look how it affects ourselves, what benefits that we've got in the short term. We might have had long-term consequences, but we had this perception of short-term benefits for the behavior. So coming to terms with what those short-term benefits are and looking at the consequences for ourselves, our partners, our families, and our community members. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So expanding our definitions of abusive behavior and talking about the experiences of victim survivors, it's really important. Lots of times as men, we tend to tune it out. If we say that I've not myself sexually assaulted somebody or I have not myself physically assaulted somebody, then that kind of gives me a pass. And, we're not really thinking about numerous other controlling and abusive behaviors we might have had. Maybe they weren't overtly violent behaviors, but they were certainly on some form abusive and controlling behaviors. And what it's like for other people to have to experience that, whether it's coworkers or community members or other family members, when we have a perception that our behavior is better than somebody else's, we tend not to take responsibility for it. We tend to use that justification that I'm not one of the ones who is overtly physically or sexually violent. Towards others, and therefore I deserve this. I should be treated differently. And really, it's better to kind of look at this on a continuum of behaviors. I myself have been working with men for the past 33 years, and I don't separate myself out from the men. even though I have not physically or sexually assaulted a woman, I know that over time, especially when I was a younger man, much of my behavior has made people uncomfortable. I know that there's still times in my joking or in my conversation that I may say something I may not have meant to offend somebody, but if I'm paying attention, I can see that it has offended somebody. And so even to be able to acknowledge that, being able to not just some people say, well, I don't participate in telling sexist jokes or racist jokes, but they may still uncomfortably laugh at that joke. And when you do that, people notice, and it kind of gives permission. People don't necessarily challenge other men when they do make those kinds of statements or use that kind of behavior. And yes, it may be very difficult, but if we're trying to expand their definitions about abusive behavior, it can be done in very subtle ways. Just simple statements like, I used to think that way, but I'm looking at things different now, or, boy, that could really be offensive to somebody, or that could really hurt somebody's feelings, and really taking it to another level of not just stopping whatever the behavior is, being able to expand your definition about what an abusive or what a controlling behavior is, and some of the tactics that we may have used. I know that in my work with the men that I've been engaged with over the years in programming, many of them come in saying, well, I'm not that guy that has busted somebody's bone or bruised or cut them in some way. And then when we start talking about examples or showing this even 2 to 3 minute little vignettes of different kinds of controlling behavior, then they're saying, well, how did you get the camera in my living room? Because word for word, that's exactly how things are done in my household. And so, I wasn't looking at it about not only the privilege that I had to act in that way, but I wasn't looking at the amount of damage and harm I was causing, and that I was passing the behavior on to my children, and that my children then were starting to replicate some of the same behavior. So really being able to talk to victim survivors about that experience. And let's move to the next slide. Really shifting the focus is important when we're trying to engage men. There's so much victim-blaming language out there, sometimes from as little as, asking the question why women stay in relationships like that, and as opposed to really talking about, what are the barriers that get erected when somebody tries to make a positive change, whether it's a victim survivor, a woman trying to leave an abusive relation, or somebody trying to make the relationship that they have better, the difficulties that they're encountering, whether it's that person who is attempting to leave, or if it's us ourselves and the barriers that men have when we are curious about or are attempting to make changes in our life, but then other men are putting us down for it. So we really want to shift the focus away from any kind of victim-blaming language to, how we can look at what the barriers are that get erected for women, for any victim survivor. And again, I say any victim survivor because I acknowledge that there are men, there are children, boys and girls, that are victims of this behavior, victims of the words that are said. And I also acknowledge that that our pets and other wildlife even in our community sometimes are victims of this. I mean, how many times have we seen somebody be mad at a family member and then kick the cat out of the house? And that's a mild example, or they're upset with something happened and then they, chew out the dog or kick the dog, right? But there's also more extreme examples. I've had lots of men talk about, killing pets to get at their partners, cutting off the ears of dogs and sending them in the mail to partners, and much more. And so particularly in tribal communities, this is important because oftentimes some of the spirit animals that we have are the ones that get targeted. It could be as simple as the example that I know that this man would, whose partner spirit animal was a spider, would deliberately kill spiders in front of his partner just to kind of get at her, to get under her skin. So there again, it's an example of acknowledging that behavior is abusive, that it's done with a purpose, that, you know, somebody else would say, particularly from a non-tribal community, might say that, well, killing a spider is an abuse towards women, but again, culturally, it could be an example of cultural abuse, and it definitely, I've seen the impact that has had on some victim survivors in the past. So I can't emphasize enough that that's important to talk to men about the victim blaming stuff. And I know that whenever people give examples about how women are, I always challenge that and say, well, as men, don't we gossip, you know, or you're using that example for women, but is it really gender specific? And do you yourself or do other men that you know use those kinds of behaviors? And usually it's, yeah, they do. And so they want to attribute it to a gender issue when really it's kind of universal behavior. Next slide, please. I would ask, when we're trying to engage men in the community, I'd ask them how women are being treated in the community, and how does that measure up to your traditional teachings. And again, you know, oftentimes I've been in longhouses and sweat lodges and gatherings around the fire, and people are talking in very positive ways, and they're praying for, you know, everyone. They're praying for men and women and children. They're praying for all the critters, you know, four-leggeds, wingeds, the creepy crawlers, the fish. They're praying for the earth and for the air we breathe, and you know, and they're doing real positive things. But then they go home and treat their family members differently than how they were just talking. And sometimes even after ceremony, sitting around talking, and then somebody will tell a joke, and that joke is really at the expense of somebody else, gender-wise or not, and not thinking about, wow, I was just in there doing all this positive stuff, and then here I come out and in a very subtle way, I've just perpetuated some pretty negative thought patterns. So always kind of challenging men to look around as we're trying to engage them in doing this work, and say, well, you know, look around. How are our community members being treated? How are our relatives being treated? How are women and children and other men being treated? And how does that measure up to truly what our traditional teachings are? Next slide, please. Supporting men in attempting, supporting men attempting this challenge by providing opportunities for their growth and change. You know, can there be talking circles? Can there be gatherings where men can talk about health and wellness and accountability? That accountability is a huge notion in doing this work, right? And you know, we get caught in the crossfire lots of times between, you know, the work around chemical, you know, alcohol and drug kind of health, and this other issue of physical and sexual violence, and you know, and sometimes the work is very parallel, but it doesn't necessarily cross over. And examples I like to give are, there's lots of my folks in my colleagues, my friends who do work around addiction issues, and they'll talk about the notion of hope as that's something that's really important and that you would want to focus on. And hope is not the same thing as personal accountability. And so I'd like to give a quick example of that, and then maybe I'll pause for a minute and ask for questions. But I remember a time when I was living in the Midwest, real rural about 20 miles north of Duluth, Minnesota, and pretty blustery winters up there. And if you've lived in snow country like our friends that are on the phone from up in Alaska, you know that sometimes people get stuck in snow drifts in their vehicles, and I was aware of that, and I always was equipped to not only get myself dug out, which I would do on get stuck on occasion, but to help others as well. And one time I'm trying to get home, and in the middle of the road is this car stuck. And I walk up to the car, and it's got two men and a woman and 3 young kids in the car. And it's cold, and they're stuck in the snow. And I can tell that they haven't even opened the car door, that they didn't even get out to see if they could do anything. And so I walked up to their window and I said, what's going on? And they said, well, we're stuck. I said, well, I can see that, but what are you doing about it? And they said, well, we're hoping that somebody would come along and to help us. And so thank you for coming along. And I said, so I just looked at them and I said, well, you were hoping that somebody would help you, and is there a reason why you're not out there trying to get yourself dug out? And they said, well, we don't have a snow shovel. So I wasn't about to shame them about driving around in snow country without a snow shovel, but I did want to challenge them before I just offered help. And so I said, okay, one thing I want to point out is while you're sitting here, your muffler is getting covered in snow, and so sooner or later you're going to be asphyxiating those kids in the back seat, if not yourself. I said, the second thing, I see that you didn't get out and try to shovel any of the snow away. And they said, well, we don't have a shovel. We told you that. And I said, well, what do you have? Well, I don't know. I said, well, let's look in your trunk. So, the 2 men got out, and the woman would have gladly got out and assisted. Actually, she was more willing to get out and do something than the men were. They were just kind of sitting there saying, being, helpless, hoping that somebody was going to come and assist them. And so we opened the trunk, and there was a screwdriver in there, and there was one of those tools, for taking the lug nuts off your car. And I said, well, there you go. And they just looked at me, and they said, well, what are you talking about? You can't shovel snow with those things. I said, no, you can't. But what you can do is take that screwdriver and that other thing, and you can pop off a couple of hubcaps. And you could use those hubcaps and start to shovel that snow away. And so once they got busy doing that, then I got my shovel out and assisted them, and I hooked up my chain, and I pulled them backwards out of the snowdrift, and then between the hubcaps and my shovel, we were able to clear a path. But again, hope is important. Hope is really meaningful. It's something that we can, all of us, use. But when we're talking about personal accountability, it's not the same thing. So when we're trying to encourage people to be personally accountable, and we go to that place of encouraging hope, then we really take the focus away. And of course, when your mind is struggling with 2 different notions, one is that the very hard notion of being more personally accountable, and the other is being more hopeful for assistance from others, your mind's going to settle on the easier path to take, and that's the hoping piece. And so while I'm not putting down hope, I just want to be clear that at times hope can be dangerous, and that it's important for us to, if we're going to change behavior and if we're going to encourage men to be involved in doing this work, that we really want to keep the focus on accountability. And that notion in itself is hard enough to understand and to struggle with. And so keeping the focus on personal accountability is very important. Those people, by the way, I ran into them about a month later, and they were very helpful, happy that I stopped and helped them. But what they said to me was, you know what, it was great that you helped us, and also what was even better was it really taught us a lesson, and now we keep extra things in the car. and we're much more proactive when something happens about, okay, how can I get myself out of this dilemma? How can I change what's going on, and not just hope? Okay, so if we can go to the next slide. We can pause for a moment in case people have questions, comments, concerns, statements that they want to make. It's so awkward for me not to see all your faces, whether it's to see your eyes roll, or or nods that you want to hear more. So, okay.
Don, this is Ron with Redland. Yep. As you were talking, as you've been going along here, it's been like about 35 years ago, there was this news person, a personality, who at the end of every show, he said, "Be kind." You know, kind of like what's his name said, and here's the rest of the story. Well, he closed every one of his broadcasts with saying, "And be kind." And for some reason, I don't know. It's kind of like I kind of got this feeling like people should, or what I was hearing is people should be more kind to me. And but this notion of accountability, what I found myself doing sometime later was imparting when I was talking with other men would be to say something to the effect of, "And be kind to your children." You know, regardless of what the conversation was or how well I knew a person, I would throw something in there, and usually men would kind of pause, and some of them would really show interest. Well, what do you mean? You know, and I'd give an example of how in a situation like this I find it necessary to really focus on how I'm treating other people and such. And I don't know, just the notion of bringing accountability into other men's lives really is important. And there's that thing about hope that you've pointed out repeatedly, and these ways of pulling men into a level of consciousness that's somewhat different. There are many ways, and I just wanted to point out that that's a very simple one.
Well, I think there's lots of men that would be far more willing to show kindness to their children than they would to their partners. So again, yes, kindness is another important issue to talk about, and a real simple but a real important and powerful thing. But there's lots of men that we're working with in programs that are very willing to be supportive of their daughters, of their nieces, and to provide opportunity and to treat them kindly and to treat them respectfully. But they don't afford those same opportunities to our partners and to adult women. And so, again, when we're talking about an issue of accountability and trying to wrap our heads around that, it's much more comfortable for us to talk about notions of kindness or hope and those kinds of things. But then it draws the mind away from that issue about how important it is for us as men to be more personally accountable. And if we're more personally accountable, then our level of kindness, respect, support, all that rises. We become more kind and respectful towards others, and we start to get more of that back. And that's that piece about compassion, being able to be compassionate in doing this work, understanding that, a lot of the men that we're looking down on for having pretty controlling behavior, they have learned that behavior from other community members. They have learned that behavior from their relatives, from respected men in the community, that people somewhere along the way have given them this kind of notion that they are entitled to act that way as men. And challenging that is a pretty new thing, a pretty hard thing for them in many ways. So being able to have the compassion to acknowledge when they're struggling with these issues and trying to create positive change, and also having the willingness, the courage, you might say, to encourage them for further growth, to hold them accountable, to be able to say, Don, I really appreciate the positive things you're doing, but I've got to tell you the way you were talking at that meeting was not helpful. Or, when you roll your eyes when you're talking to me, that's not helpful, right? When you sigh, rather than talk to me directly, that's not helpful. And so there's this level of kindness, hope, and compassion that is a really delicious and comforting mix for all of us to have, and we need to have that towards the men in our community if we want to engage them, if we want to encourage them, but we also need to have the willingness and the courage to encourage further growth, to push them in new directions. Right. So providing them opportunity, I think, which was a previous slide mentioned in one of the previous slides, just providing them opportunity, encouraging them to be involved, inviting them along. If you're showing a film or something, bring somebody along with. If you're having a meeting, take an uncle, take a cousin, take a male friend, take a coworker, encourage them in subtle ways to come along. Oh, no, we're not asking you to, come work for us necessarily, but we're just trying to encourage you to understand more and to be more involved. Next slide, please.
Thank you for elaborating.
Highlight the opportunities they have, when men in the community, as well as women, but if we're talking about engaging men, thinking about when they're in the role as a teacher, as a parent or a teacher or a coach or a coworker, when they're leading drum groups, when they're coaching basketball or softball, when they're teaching the language, that those are all real important things in the community, and it also gives them a forum and an opportunity to challenge some of that behavior. And when it happens in very subtle ways, I remember doing children's classes, and along with I was doing children's classes for children, along with the classes for the men that I was doing. And I remember a very simple thing where we would have one kid get the snacks and one kid get the water when we would have a break. We always used water in case there were allergies, and we didn't want to get them sugared up with some of the other stuff. I learned that the hard way. So, and it just so happened, unbeknownst, or not being conscious of it, for the first 2 weeks, I had asked a boy to get the water, and but for the snacks I had alternate boy and girl. So for the first few weeks, for some reason, and these kids who were only like 7, 8, 9 years old, they noticed that. And so on the whatever it was, third or fourth week, I asked one of the girls to get the water. There was a couple of boys that stood right up and said, "Hey, it's the boys that get the water." So right away they were internalizing that, if this is a repeated pattern, then it must be the boys who get to do that. So we're entitled then as males to be in charge of that, right? And yes, there was some pride in it, but it was also that they were already, delineating, what's a woman's role, what's a male's role. And so being able to talk to them in a very gentle way about, I made a mistake. And that really, this is a shared task for everybody. And just as I'm alternating for the food, who gets the food, it's important that the girls in the class in the group, they also have the opportunity to get the water. So, really, as coaches, as teachers, examining our own behavior. Just because we've done something, we may, for a long time, we may not realize that we have contributed in some way to some gender equality. And so it's important for us to look at that, and to look at that we have the opportunity when we're in positions like that to be able to encourage other people to be involved. Next slide, please. Provide opportunities for men to be involved in public actions or initiatives, campaigns to end violence and promote healthy communities. Yes, you can invite them in some ways to be along for the marches and think about what roles they can take. Even if they can't be speakers at some of the events. They could be the people who sit at the tables and hand out brochures and things like that. That there's ways of showing support, you know, if you're having workshops and all the rest, whereas men can be greeters and be there and show our support, whether or not we're standing up in front of a crowd or in front of a room full of people and being the ones talking. Right, and encourage them to be involved in meetings and to listen. You know, I find myself all the time. I'll be involved in some meeting, and all of a sudden I'll hear my voice too much. Right, and it took me years to get over myself. Right? Just because I have a good idea doesn't mean that I'm the one that should be saying it. And oftentimes, if I'm patient and wait, you know, somebody else will come up with that same notion. Right. I mean, certainly if you're asked as a man to give your input, that's one thing, but I don't as a man, have to be speaking all the time. That it's important for me to look at the women who are talking in the meeting. And so every time that I'm involved in some kind of public action or initiative or some campaign or some kind of small thing, you know, right from the beginning, each time I'm involved in something like that, I learn a little bit more and I become a little bit more healthy myself. Can we move on, please? I keep hearing those beeps. I keep thinking people are hanging up on me because I'm not really getting many questions. Okay. So the more men are visible in the community being involved in these issues, then the more it encourages other men. You know, when they see us standing up, when they see us being involved, it takes some of the stigma away from it. It gives us permission to be involved. It gives us another man to walk up to and talk to. And so when I'm involved at different things and there's men in the room, I want to acknowledge their presence and I want to engage them in conversation. Can we move to the next slide, please? So the more we're being involved, the more the message that gets out that both men and women have a stake in ending violence against women, that this is not a woman's issue, it's a man's issue, it's a community issue, it's a community health issue. It is not just about one gender. It is not the responsibility of women to educate men. It's our responsibility to educate ourselves. That doesn't mean that we can't learn a lot from women and that we shouldn't be learning a lot from women, but that I'm just saying that it's important for us at this point that we start to engage more men to do that by just following some of these simple things that we've been talking about, or at least I've been talking about today so far. Next slide. And you know, there is a basic truth that you know, and maybe this is in reverse as well. But just speaking as a man and working with men and encouraging men to do this work, there is a basic truth that when our grandmothers, our mothers, our aunties and sisters, daughters and nieces, our girlfriends, our women friends, when they are living happier and healthier lives, that we and men are as well. That it not only raises the health and happiness for them, it raises the health and happiness for myself and for other men in the community, and then that is something that is important, and that's a way in which we make healthier, that we grow healthier communities. Next slide. So we're getting near the end here, and it's just a reminder here. This slide is just a reminder that we are all related, and that's one of the things about doing this work in tribal communities that's drastically different than doing it in more mainstream or majority communities is the notion that we are all related, and that if you look at somebody as a relative and encourage them to be a better relative, to be a better family member, that's different than just doing the old finger wagging and that you've done a wrong thing and you needed to change your ways. Right? When we work together on this issue, we can all make a difference. And in doing that, again, just extremely important to keep the notion about who's been doing this work, who's initiated this work, and respecting that, realizing who's been causing the most harm and who is the most harm been caused towards, and keeping that in the forefront, and thinking about how we can alleviate the harm and how we can work towards having healthier communities, and encouraging all community members to be involved. Listen to the voices of elders and the voices of youth, and encourage men to work alongside women to do this work. So I was told we had an hour to do this. There's a few minutes left for questions if somebody has one. I would encourage you to, if we get off the phone and you want to have conversation, you can call me on my cell phone. I get calls days, evenings, weekends. That doesn't bother me. I got a call this morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, from somebody who just wanted to talk about men's programming. That's a little early, I guess, but, she was from a different time zone and didn't really realize that, at the time when she called. So I just take the calls when they come in. I appreciate the talking to colleagues around the country. So if you're a man or if you're a woman who wants to engage in further dialogue, please give me a call or contact me through email. I wish you all just clear vision in doing this work and strong winds beneath the wings of your programs. I just would also really encourage all of you to be safe, and remember that we have relatives who are having a hard time or in a hard way during this time of year, and so take care of yourselves and reach out to others. Thank you very much for sharing this time with me. I'm going to stay on the phone here for a few minutes in case there are any questions. I encourage you to also, if you need resources or want more information, to be in touch with Red Wind. I think you obviously have their information, and the director, Vicki Alanis herself, has a wealth of information, and she has a good resource list of materials and a good resource list of people who can assist you in other communities. So from Red Wing and from myself, I would say, Miigwech, thank you for sharing this time with me. Be safe, be well, and do good work. Thank you.